Okay, we've already talked about the problems of using these texts historically. If you remember early in the semester, we talked about Galatians 1 and 2 and Acts, and we tried to compare exactly when did Paul go where with regard to Jerusalem, Damascus, Antioch, and we saw that it's very, very difficult to harmonize Galatians 1 and 2 with the account of Acts and Paul's movements around Jerusalem. We've also got a lot of other situations where this would be very difficult. I mentioned the difference between Matthew and Luke as far as the birth narratives. According to, just to try to figure out how this would work, if you took the birth narratives of Matthew and Luke, it would be very, very difficult to find out historically what happened. So, for example, if you just take Matthew, as I've said before, his family seems to simply be in Bethlehem. It doesn't say they're from Galilee. It doesn't say they're originally from Nazareth. They're just in Bethlehem. And they're in Bethlehem well before Jesus is born because the wise men in the east see the star, and it takes them enough time to travel from Persia. We're supposed to understand from the narrative because they're called Magi, and those are wise men from Persia, all the way to Jerusalem. They meet up with King Herod the Great. He gets his wise men to consult. They then find out they're supposed to go to Bethlehem. They journey to Bethlehem, and then they get there not long after Jesus is born. So according to Matthew, you don't have any time actually in the narrative of Matthew for the whole moving from Nazareth to Bethlehem narrative that you get in the Gospel of Luke. You just don't have time in Matthew. They're just there. And then the angel appears to Joseph in a dream and says, Herod's going to kill all the babies. So Joseph takes the family. They move to Egypt for a while. He gets another dream years later, how many years, who knows, but saying that Herod the Great is now dead. So they go back. They start to go back to Bethlehem because it says that's their home, right? They go back home. They're going to go to Bethlehem. Instead, they move to Galilee to avoid Herod's son, who is at the time, according to Matthew, ruling in Judea. That's the sort of narrative. You get to Luke, and it's very different. They're from Nazareth. That's sort of Mary's hometown is Nazareth. All the pregnancy of Jesus takes place with Mary in Nazareth. She even goes to Judea to visit her kinswoman Elizabeth, who's the mother of John the Baptist, according to the Gospel of Luke. And then she goes back to Nazareth, and then it's according to this census, the world census, that they go to Bethlehem. And it's why they're in Bethlehem in the stable, because you don't have a stable in Matthew. They're just maybe in a home, or according to a lot of traditions, there was a cave somewhere that Jesus was born in. But it's in Luke that you get the whole story about the Christmas story about the stable that Jesus is born in, because there's no room in the inn. They stay in that area for a month. We know that because it says that they first have Jesus circumcised on the 8th day from his birth, and then the time of purification takes place according to Leviticus, which is about a month long. They take Jesus to the presentation in the temple in Jerusalem, and it's after that, so a month or so after his birth, that they then move back home to Nazareth. Now, there's no way you can basically get these two narratives to fit together in any respectable historical way. Does that mean that nobody's ever tried to do it? No, of course, you've got all kinds of very, very smart fundamentalists who believe that the New Testament has to be accurate in every historical and scientific detail, or they believe then it can't be Scripture. And they will figure out some way to try to make sure that both these narratives can be fit together. But what I'm telling you is that no reputable historian will accept this, because you just have to fudge the stuff too much. You have to fudge the data. So what do we believe about the birth of Jesus? Most of us think we don't know anything about the birth of Jesus. All the Christmas stories are later tradition. Probably the one thing that most of us would say is that Jesus probably was from Nazareth. His family was simply from Nazareth because he's called Jesus of Nazareth. And the traditions that got him to Bethlehem for his birth are probably later pietistic traditions that Matthew and Luke later developed for different reasons, but to get Jesus born in Bethlehem for fulfillment of prophecy reasons. So if you take the birth of Jesus as in Luke and Matthew, it's, from a historical point of view, it's impossible really to harmonize them without coming up with fantastic, unbelievable conjugations of Jesus moving back and forth to Egypt and the Holy Family and all this sort of thing. We get lots of other kinds of things about this too. What are some obvious historical problems with a historical Jesus? Well, one of the things is the trial of Jesus. there are different versions of the trial of Jesus in the Gospels. And unfortunately, basically, most scholars will say that we don't really know what happened to the trial of Jesus. We don't even know for sure whether there was any kind of official trial. It may have been that he was just arrested in the middle of the night. He was just then they've given permission to be crucified, and he was crucified the next day. That would be the sensible way of doing things. You didn't have to have, the Romans didn't need elaborate trials in order to crucify Jews who were rabble-rousers in the first century. They did it all the time. But if you look at some of the details of the trial, notice how they're very different. Mark 14, get your Bibles out. Today we are talking about the historical Jesus, but I'm not just going to tell you what I believe or what scholars believe about the historical Jesus. I'm going to try to show you why scholars come up with ideas that we have, how we get there. What is our method for arriving at historical Jesus discussions? So look at Mark 14, verse 53. In the wrong place. They took Jesus to the high priest, and all the chief priests, the elders, and the scribes were assembled. Peter had followed him at a distance, right into the courtyard of the high priest, and he was sitting with the guards, warming himself at the fire. Now the chief priests and the whole council were looking for testimony against Jesus to put him to death, but they found none. For many gave false testimony against him, and their testimony did not agree. Some stood up and gave false testimony against him, saying, "We have heard him say, 'I will destroy this temple that is made with hands, and in 3 days I will build another not made with hands.' But even on this point their testimony did not agree. Then the high priest stood up before them and asked Jesus, 'Have you no answer? What is it that they testify against you?' But he was silent and did not answer. Again the high priest asked him, 'Are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One?' Jesus said, 'I am, and you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming with the clouds of heaven.'" That's a quotation from Daniel. So Jesus basically just says, "I am," and then quotes Daniel. And then it says, the high priest accused him of prophecy. And then look at chapter 15. Beginning of chapter 15. As soon as it was morning, the chief priests held a consultation with the elders and scribes and the whole council. They bound Jesus, led him away, and handed him over to Pilate. Pilate asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" He answered him, "You say so." Then the chief priests accused him of many things. Pilate asked him again, "Have you no answer? See how many charges they bring against you." But Jesus made no further reply, so that Pilate was amazed. Now notice, all Jesus says at his trial, according to Mark, the oldest of our written testimonies, is "I am," and a quotation of Scripture at one point, and then "so you say," in the next trial before Pilate. Now compare that to what goes on in the Gospel of John. I mentioned this a bit in my lecture on the Gospel of John, how its narrative details are very different from the Synoptic Gospels. One of the places where this is really different is the trial of Jesus. John 18, verse 19. I'm not going to read all of this because it's just way too long. This is part of the interesting thing is that the trial of Jesus goes on for a long time in the Gospel of John. The high priest questioned Jesus about his disciples, about his teaching. Jesus answered, "I have spoken openly to the world. I have always taught in synagogues and in the temple where all the Jews come together. I have said nothing in secret. Why do you ask me?" Already, Jesus has said a ton more now than he said in the other Gospels at his trial. But then he just keeps going on. He said some more things. When he had said this, one of the police standing nearby struck Jesus in the face, saying, "Is that how you answer the high priest?" Jesus answered, "If I have spoken wrongly, testify to the wrong, but if I have spoken rightly, why do you strike me?" Then Annas sent him bound to Caiaphas, the high priest. So according to John, Annas and Caiaphas are kinfolk, and they're sort of both members of the high priestly family. So you can go on and on. At 28, verse 28, is the trial before they took Jesus to Pilate. Pilate went out to the Jews and said, "What accusation do you bring against this man?" They answered, "If this man were not a criminal, we would not have handed him over to you." Pilate said to them, "Take him yourselves and judge him according to your law." The Jews answered, "We are not permitted," blah, 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 blah. It goes on. Pilate talks to Jesus. "Are you the king of the Jews?" Jesus answered, "Do you ask this on your own? Did others tell you about it?" Pilate said, "I'm not a Jew, am I? Your own nation and the chief priests handed you over to me. What have you done?" Jesus said, "My kingdom is..." Jesus just has a whole conversation with Pilate, which leads to that wonderfully quotable phrase that everybody knows about, where finally Jesus talks about truth, and Pilate says, in a phrase that could be sincere, or a lot of people answer it as being cynical, "What is truth?" Very famous quotation from the Gospel of John. And then, of course, there's the whole passage. Any of you seen Jesus Christ Superstar, the play or the movie, there's a whole scene where Herod, this is actually the son of Herod the Great now, but there's a trial before Herod, also in the Gospel of John, not really in Mark at all, but in the Gospel of John you get this whole trial before Herod, and according to Jesus Christ Superstar, this is when Herod kind of dances around on this raft and has showgirls, and they all do this, so you are the Christ, you're the great Jesus Christ, you know, prove to me that you're no fool, walk across my swimming pool, and all this sort of thing. So there's a whole scene, and Jesus Christ Superstar, the whole scene wouldn't be possible without the Gospel of John, because it's not in the other Gospels. So this is a famous scene. All of that's different in John. So what's historical? How do scholars decide? You have these very, very different. Was Jesus completely silent at his trial, as it seems to be in the Gospel of Mark? Did he not offer any reasons for what he did? Or did he have theological and philosophical discussions with Pilate about his message? What's historical? In that case, basically most historians are going to say none of it is. None of the trial stuff can we be confident would be historical. For one thing, we just have this very, very differences, but there's one very little interesting piece of evidence about this. According to all the Gospels, where were the disciples after Jesus was arrested? Anybody remember? They vamoosed. The Gospels say that the disciples ran away at the arrest of Jesus. So maybe, according to these traditions, maybe Peter was there sort of in a courtyard out removed from the trial. But none of the disciples of Jesus would have been allowed to be present at any trial, whether it was of his high priest or Pilate. They wouldn't have been allowed in. These were peasants from Galilee. They're fishermen. They don't go walking into Pilate's headquarters. So who would have been there to report these different trial things? There are no stenographers in the ancient world sitting down taking notes of these trials. There are no court records. There are no journalists. Nobody was there who later Christians had access to so that they could possibly have known what went on in the trial. So according to most historians, we just say all of this trial stuff was very much made up by later Christians. Why? Because they figured you had to have a trial if you're going to have Jesus condemned. And so they figured, well, what would have taken place? These gospel writers, or maybe they're using traditions that developed before them, they're using traditions that develop because people just say, well, what would have happened at Jesus' trial? What's likely to have happened? And then they make up that likeliness and they put that into the story. Now, so you've got a couple of different situations where we historians are very, very skeptical about some of the basic aspects of the Gospel's accounts as far as what they tell us about the historical Jesus. The birth narratives, we just throw up our hands. The trials before Pilate, no, probably none of it rises to the level of history. But this leads to a couple of different problems. The first one I'm going to talk about is, so what? And I'm saying this because once critical scholars start talking about the historical Jesus, we immediately start stepping into sand traps. On the one hand, we have good Christian people who are a bit afraid that if you start questioning the historical reliability of the Gospels, then you're going to undermine every aspect of Christian faith. If the birth narratives are not as they say they are in the Gospels, then how can you trust any of it to be true? And if none of it is true, how do you even know that Jesus actually even existed? Or even if he did exist, how do you know that he wasn't a liar or a magician or just a bum? How do you, and if that's true, why have faith? Why not just give up the whole thing? So on the one hand, you've got Christians who are very threatened by using typical historical tools on the Gospels and the very question of the historical Jesus. On the other hand, we have just as many people who are anti-Christian and who they want to grab onto this and say, aha, notice how reputable scholars like Dale Martin, Woolsey Professor of Religious Studies at Yale University, points out that not everything in the Gospels is reliably history. Well, that means it's all a bunch of bunk. and every Christian in the world is basing their faith on things that are known by scholars to be lies. Well, that's not exactly right either, is it? So on both sides, you get some people who grab onto any sort of idea that historians would say these are discrepancies in the Gospels, or these are places where we don't have historical evidence to back us up, and they want to run with that precisely in order to impugn the faith of Christians. Now, so scholars have to be very careful. What we basically want to say, there was actually one or two scholars in the 19th century, reputable scholars. Bruno Bauer was one of them, a German scholar, who denied that Jesus ever existed. He just said it was all, even the person of Jesus was a myth created by the church. And you'll find every once in a while somebody on the, on the web or internet or something, or in some crazy blog saying that Jesus never existed. But reputable historical scholars all admit that Jesus of Nazareth existed. There was a guy back there, Jesus of Nazareth. There's just too much evidence that he existed, and it's just not controvertible when it comes to reliable historical evidence. But that's a big difference from saying, yes, we believe he existed, and there are some things we think we can say about him, to accepting all of the gospel materials as reliable. So scholars basically are caught in the middle of saying, we believe there was a Jesus of Nazareth. We believe we might even be able to say some things as historians about who he was, what he said, what he did, why he may have been executed, and that sort of thing. But that means we have to use critical historical tools to analyze these faith-based texts, these theological texts, what are indeed, in some cases, mythological texts. We read theological texts to try to figure out what we can say historically. And that leads to the other issue. I keep saying the historical Jesus, because a whole lot of people have the idea that once I give you the historical Jesus, then you've got the real Jesus. You've got Jesus as he really was, and therefore Jesus as he really is. Now the problem with that is that theologians, and I can put on my historical hat most of the time because I actually have a job as a historian. I don't really have a job as a theologian, so I kind of call myself sometimes an amateur theologian. But if I want to put on my amateur theologian hat, I can make a case for you why the historical Jesus is not a very good foundation for Christian faith. It's not reliable as a foundation of Christian faith. It's not sufficient as a foundation for Christian faith. The theological Jesus, the Jesus of Christian confession, is not the historical Jesus. The Jesus of theological confession is the Jesus that matches what the church has traditionally believed about Jesus. So, for example, a Jesus that matches the creeds, a Jesus that matches Christian confessions. So one of the most important things for Christian confession, for example, is would you lose your faith if you believe that Jesus wasn't born in Bethlehem but was rather born in Nazareth? Probably most Christians would probably say, well, no, that's not really that important. What's the most central thing for most Christians for Christian faith? Do you believe that somehow God was in Jesus Christ reconciling the world to himself, to quote the Apostle Paul? Or do you believe that Jesus Christ is divine? Do you believe that Jesus is God? Do you believe that Jesus is God incarnate, God in the flesh? That's a fundamental aspect of Christian faith for most Christians. But notice, that's not something that historians can pronounce about one way or another. There's no possible way that I, practicing history by the normal historiographical tools of history, could tell you whether God was in Jesus Christ. Is there? I mean, just think about it. How would I test that? How would I figure it out? What would count as a positive proof? What would count as a non-controvertible negative truth? There's no such thing. So when I'm talking to you about the historical Jesus, I have to get over several hurdles. One of the hurdles is trying to show you that the historical Jesus is a construction made by historians practicing the typical trade of modern historians. It's just